Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf tzadi dalid. We're going to start with a quick review of our Mishnah. We saw in the Mishnah, we were talking about the mitzvah of cleaning blood off of clothing and also the issue of the different vessels that the sacrifices were cooked in, and there were methods of either cleaning them or breaking them because of the issue that we couldn't leave the meat that was in them or absorbed in them anywhere past the time that the meat is permitted, or have them then, which is forbidden, get into other vessels. So we're going to start with the machloket in the Mishnah between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Elazar. We're going to see it more in depth in this braita. So we started with a braita at the end of Tzadi Gimel. Tanu Rabbanan, beged en li ela beged. So the beged that's a piece of cloth. How do we know also, or mishuvshat, the hide once it's taken off the animal? Talmud lomar asher yazeh alav techabes. Right, so that's including something additional. It must be something that's not yet considered a beged, which is the skin when it's taken off the animal, but we haven't yet designated it to be used for something in particular. So it's not yet impure, but it's potentially is going to become impure down the road. So that's enough for Rabbi Yehuda. And that's what he says. Asher yazeh alav comes to include some additional case. So maybe even before it's taken off the animal, it has to be it is potentially to become impure. This also needs to be. That's the Rabbi Yehuda. I'm still reviewing yesterday's daf. Now we're starting with Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar says, beged, and liela beged, minayin l'rabot sack. He says it comes to include a sack, okay, which is made of goat hairs, v'chol minei begadim, and other types of garments or cloths. Talmud lamal asher aleha techabes. Okay, because it's actually asher yazeh aleha techabes, which again is an inclusive term. Yachol shani marbe or mishuvshat. So you might have thought I would include hide after it's taken off the animal, like Rabbi Yehuda. Well, Talmud lomar beged. No, it has to be like a cloth. Ma beged davar mekabel tuma, av kol davar mekabel tuma. So just like clothing is something that's susceptible to impurity, this also needs to be susceptible to impurity. And a piece of leather, before I've designated what I'm going to do with it, is not susceptible to impurity yet. My benayu, what's the difference between them? Now we know what the difference is between them. It's leather. So Rashi explains what's really the source of their debate, and that's why do they each understand beged in a different way. Okay, so Rashi says, "Heicham matzinu beged haraoel kabel tuma ve'eno mekabla." In other words, where does Rabbi Yehuda get this really? That sometimes you could have a beged that's not yet potential, that it isn't susceptible to impurity, but we're still going to maybe consider it a beged because it could potentially. So for this, we're going to have three answers. One is Abaye, two are Rava. Some people think that one of the Ravas is really Rava because it doesn't make sense. Rava would answer two answers. So Amar Abaye, Matali Pchutami Shalosh Ikabenai. Abaye says we're talking about a cloth that's less than 3 by 3 fingers, or some people say it's shlosha, which would be shlosha tvachim, just 3 by 3 handbreadths. Okay, there's a big difference because a handbreadth is made up of 4 etzbaot, 4 fingers. So it's a lot bigger. These are shiurim that we use in general to discuss. Right? A poor person will use something that's much smaller that a rich person will just throw away. So a rich person, it's usually 3 by 3 tvachim. 3 by 3 fingers is something only a poor person would use, but they wouldn't really use less than that. So it's either less than that or it's the in between that shiur and that shiur. Now, manta amar ra'oi hanami ra'oi. So now if you have a cloth that's less than 3 by 3, either fingers or handbreadths, so you might not use it, but theoretically you could decide you're going to use it, and that would turn it into something that's susceptible to impurity. Because if you wanted, you could say, I want to use this, and then it will be. So that's potentially could be. And that's Rabbi Yehuda. Since it could be, we could call that a cloth. Manda amar davar mekabel tum'ah hami alav bar kibule tumahu. But if you say that's not right now a beged, so that's Rabbi Elazar. He says, so what if potentially you could call it a beged? You haven't yet, so it's not a beged right now. Rava Amaus, these are all going to be very similar. They're just kind of examples. Rava Amar beged shechishev alav litzura ikbenai. If you plan to embroider, so you have a garment and you plan to embroider it, but you haven't yet. Okay, so I was thinking nowadays, right? You go to get an iron-on printed on your shirt, some sort of design. So when you go to the store, let's say you go to a store, that's all they do. They don't sell regular shirts. So are those shirts that they have that don't have any design on them yet, anything printed, are those shirts already considered shirts or not yet? Because no one's going to use them until you put the design on them. So, Manda Amara, if you say, look, it's potential. So hanami ra'oi. Why? Why is this ra'oi already? Because ibai mivatale lamachshavte. Now, even though you're planning to put the iron on or the printer, you're planning to print on it, but you're not gonna. You could decide. Let's say food spills on your clothes right then, and you want to change your shirt, and that's all that there is, or there's shirts. You might actually use it and say, I'm going to use this just as is. So because of that, it's already considered a baguette. But if you say it's only when it's actually ra'oi l'kabel tuma, potentially able to be, right, when it's already considered a shirt, well, this isn't a shirt yet because you're not really planning to wear it until you put the iron on. So it's not ready. Rava Amal, third answer, and like I said, another Rava, maybe it's someone else, maybe it's Rabba, but maybe it is Rava, and he's just giving another example. If you have a piece of leather that you're planning to trim before you used it, so mandamar ra'oi hanami ruya. Again, if you say Rabbi Yehuda, it's ra'oi, it's potential. You could theoretically say, you know what, I'm not going to cut it, I'm going to use as is. But it's not actually susceptible to impurity yet. So if you say it has to be actually susceptible to impurity, and that's only going to be once you cut it. How do we know this? Vatanya, it says in a braita, Rabbi Shimon ben Menasio, so if you have a piece of leather that you're planning to cut, it's not actually susceptible to impurity until you actually cut it. So these were all cases where the item is not susceptible right now, but it theoretically could be because you could change your mind about it. So Rabbi Yehuda says, since theoretically it could be, we're going to already say that it needs kibus if it got blood on it. But Rabbi Elazar says, no, it doesn't. Ein ta'un kibus. Now we go back to the Mishnah, and the Mishnah said only where the blood is. Where do we get this from? Menahane mileh. Where do we get it from? Detanu Rabbanan. Braita. Yachol nitaz al miktzat beged yehe kol habeged tun kibus. You might have thought if it gets on part of the cloth, maybe the whole piece of clothing needs washing. Talmud lomar asher yazeh. Lo amarti ela makom dam bilvad. Asher yazeh means, right, that's again, we saw before, asher yazeh aleha techabes, right, where it was sprinkled on, you have to wash. So the way they take that is literally only where it was sprinkled on, not the cloth that had something sprinkled on it, but where it was sprinkled. Davar shehu ra'oi lekabel tuma. So now the Mishnah had said, after bringing this machlok at Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Elazar, it then said, so what are the rules? It has to be where the blood is. It has to be something that potentially could be susceptible to impurity, to which the Gemara points out, okay, stomach Rabbi Yehuda. The Mishnah obviously then seems to be quoting Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. After they said there was a machloket, but now it seems to be going by Rabbi Yehuda. Ra'oi lekibus, it has to be potentially that you could clean, you could launder it. So what's that coming to exclude? Lemiuti kli. To bar gredahu. If you have a vessel, that's something you scrape the blood off. Like you have a metal vessel, you're going to scrape it off. You're not necessarily going to wash it. Echad beged ve'echad sack and ve'echad or. Okay, it said the beged, the sack, the or, all those things need kibus. Now that means, and this is going to start a whole big discussion. For this, we have a study guide to make some order of it. That means that all these things get laundered. Now, the Gemara says, L'meimra or bar kibusu. Wait, is this trying to say that leather could be laundered? Okay, why? Why wouldn't you say that? Well, uriminu. That contradicts the following Mishnah. Now we're going to start with another topic. The topic is on Shabbat, you're not allowed to launder. So it's another place where laundry comes up. And the question is, can you launder leather? So it says there, Haita lav lishleshet, if you had dirt on your clothing, mekancha b'smartut, you can take a dry cloth and dry it off, but you can't use water on your clothing. But haita, because that's laundering. But haita shel ol, if it was made of leather, noten aleha mayim ad shtechlet, you could put water until it comes out. So now, it seems like you could put water, you can launder it. So if we look at this chart from our Mishnah, it sounds like, right, even Rabbi Elazar, who says it, the hide when you take it off isn't yet susceptible to impurity. But Rabbi Elazar does hold, though, if you turned it into a vessel, you said, I'm going to use this as a jacket, you make it into a leather jacket or leather shoes or whatever it might be, it is susceptible to impurity and then it would need kibus. So they all agree in the end that leather could be washed, could be laundered. But in the Mishnah Masachet Shabbat, it seems like it's not laundering, because if it was laundering, it would be forbidden on Shabbat. And obviously each one has some ramifications. For us, if it's launder, right, if it comes under the criteria of laundry, then you're liable, then you have to launder it in the Azara, clean it out. If it's in Shabbat and it can be laundered, then it's forbidden to do on Shabbat. If we don't consider it laundry, then it's not forbidden. In the Mikdash, if we don't consider it laundry, then you don't have to wash it actually. So that's the problem. Comes Abaye, we're going to have Abaye and Rava, they each give different answers, and Rava's even going to change his answer in the middle. Amar Abaye lo kashya, harabanan ha'achirim. Abaye says, these two Tanaitic sources are Mishnah. The other Mishnah, they go by two different opinions. Okay, what's the machloket Rabbanan Achirim Titanya? Habeged v'hasak mechabso. Hakli v'haor megarero. Megarero is the same as megardo. It's scrape it. So the rabbis talk about in a different context. This is actually the context of the mikdash and having to wash out clothes, with the blood. So the rabbis say if it's a cloth or a sack, right, which again is goat hairs, then you launder it. But if it's a vessel or leather, you scrape it because there is no laundering by scraping. There's no laundering by leather. So that means the Mishna in Shabbat goes by that, and that's why they allow you to put water on it. But others say, only the vessel needs scraping, but the cloth, the sack, and the leather all need laundering, meaning you have to launder them if there's blood on them. So what do you see? That matches our Mishnah. So that's what Rabbi says. Now, we're going to bring up another source, which we're going to go through a few times and explain, according to each of our different interpretations. Kiman Azza, so according to who does this statement go? Hada Amar Rav Chia bar Ashi. Rav Chia bar Ashi said, Zimnin Sagin have a keimna kamei derives. Sometimes I go before Rav. I went before Rav, and I washed off my shoes with water on Shabbat. And he didn't say anything, didn't complain. Kiman, according to who does this go? Rabbanan, this goes according to the rabbis. How do we know? Because the rabbis say, that's right. Or how do you clean it? By scraping. And this isn't scraping, right? Doesn't come under kibus. That's forbidden on Shabbat by putting water, because that's not the way you launder it. Okay. Now comes Rav. First, he's going to raise a difficulty with Abaye. Then he's going to answer his own answer. Then he's going to raise a difficulty on himself for Zavit. And then he's going to add raise another difficulty on his own opinion and come up with a new interpretation. Okay, so let's start with Rav. Rav says, right? He says, wait a minute. Abaye, how can you possibly say that it's this machloket acherim and the rabbis, whether or is laundering or is not laundered, right? Gets laundered, doesn't get laundered. Mi kalaman damar or lav bar kibusu. How can you possibly say that you don't launder leather? V'haktiv, there's an explicit pasuk. V'abeged o ashti o ha'erev o kol kli ha'ol asher t'chabes. It's talking about leprous marks. There's a third category. You have a leprous clothing, so you have to launder it also. You have to clean it out. Now, the pasuk is talking about some particular detail in it without getting into that right now. But it says a beged and it says kli or asher techabes, that if you launder it. Now, what does that mean? Obviously, the Torah says leather goes with laundering. So no one can come later and say leather doesn't get laundered when the Torah says it explicitly. So he completely disagrees with Abaye. So how's he going to explain it now? Because we have sources that say yes, we have sources that say no. So, Abaye tried to say it's a machloket tanaim, how to understand it, but you can't say that the rabbis hold that there's no laundering by leather when it says so in the pasuk. Ela amar Rava, kra umatnitin birakim, ki pligi bekashim. The Mishnah and the pasuk, okay, meaning our Mishnah, where it says there's laundering by leather, and the Mishnah that says the pasuk by leprous clothing, is all talking about soft leather. Soft leather can get laundered. When we had this, both Mishnah in Shabbat that said you could pour water on it, and this machloket acherim and the rabbis, their machloket is about hard leather. Can hard leather be laundered? Can it not be laundered? The rabbis think it can't. It's not laundered, and that's why you can put water on it according to the Mishnah. Now, so how do you explain them, Rav Chia, and how he washes shoes? Bekashim uke Rabbanan. You have to say it was hard leather, and it was like the rabbis who say there's no washing, there's no laundering by hard leather. But after Rava says this, Rava starts with some difficulties. Okay, first difficulty. Hadran Rava. After that, he said, "Lav milti damre." It's not right what I said, because niku nemale lekra Dechiktivan birakim ktivan. How can we say this pasuk about leather clothing or leather, vessels, things made of leather, are only talking about soft leather? Mi lo askinan is a funny line. Are we not talking about clay aksalgia habaim mi medinat hayam? Wait a minute. People get these things from abroad, these leather vessels that they get. We don't know what they are. Maybe clothing, maybe shoes. We don't know. Okay, like nowadays, people like to import all sorts of nice leather items from different places. Apparently, they did that in those days as well. He says the Torah must be referring to those as well. The ka'amarach banani bai kibus, and the Torah said they need kibus. In other words, how can you say that the leather, when it just uses the general term leather, it must be talking about even these items of leather that we get from other countries, which are hard? Okay? Meaning, again, it's kind of strange because the fact that they get this kind of hard leather doesn't mean that in the Torah that's what it was referring to. But his main idea is that the Torah never says it's only soft leather, so it must be hard leather. It must include all kinds of leather. So that's not a good answer that I suggested by differentiating hard and soft. To which he answers and he says, Tzarat kevan de migufe kaparcha mechalchale u'mishavyale rach. He says no. Leprosy is now going to answer this question without rejecting his interpretation. Only the next question is going to reject his interpretation. But what he's saying here is that leprosy, since it comes out on the body, in other words, it's you're wearing the clothes on your body, and the body is, when you're wearing leather clothes, what happens? From wearing them, they soften. So basically, any clothing on the body, that we're assuming this leprous clothes are clothes that people wore, are naturally going to be soft. So we resolved issue number one. But now he comes up with another problem. And he says, Ella Amarava, Tsarat, I'm sorry, I did that already. Amarava, last line in Amud Aleph, then we'll turn to Amud Bet. Amarava, Ikashali Hakashali. But you want to raise, I really do have a real difficulty against what I said. And here's my difficulty. Karim ukisatot. Okay, now he's going to talk about pillows and covers like couches and things like that, or covers that people sleep on. Dirakininu. Now, obviously, if you're sleeping on them or sitting on them, right, it's going to be soft. You're not going to have a pillowcase that's hard. Apparently, they made pillowcases out of leather. And now we're going to quote another Mishna, Masechet Shabbat. Utnan haytashel ol. If it was leather, you put water on it until it comes out. So here you have soft leather, and you see that it can come out. Remember, he said, the Mishnah that talked about pouring water on it must have been talking about hard leather. So this doesn't make any sense then, according to what he said. Ella Amar Rava, so Rava comes up with a new explanation. Now, until now, we thought throwing water meant washing, but now he's going to say, wait, throwing water is not washing. What is it? Elam Rava, kol kibus delele kiskus lo shmei kibus. Any kibus that doesn't have washing, like rubbing, right? What do we do when we wash, right? We rub it together. That's not kibus. So if you just throw water on shoes or on a leather garment or whatever it might be, that's not laundering. And that's why for Shabbat, it's actually permitted. And what we do in the temple, right, on the or, we do water and this kiskus, which is, rubbing it together. And furthermore, Hada Amar Rav Chia Barash is in Nitzigen Avakim Nakamei Derab B'Shach Shechalei Masane B'Maya. So what do you see here? Shichshuch in aval kibus lo. It seems to be, now if we really read his words well, he says shichshuch, he pours it on, but kibus lo, but he doesn't launder it. Now, you have two ways to explain this. Either you say ibirakim ukedivre akol. Maybe it's talking about soft, and since again you did shichshuch, you didn't do shifshuf, right? You poured the water, but you didn't rub it. So then everyone agrees it's permitted, assuming it's soft. Now, if it's hard, okay, now ibikashim ukeachirim. Now, we didn't really discuss hard until now in Rabbah, but now we're going to see that the machloket, since everyone agrees that soft leather is laundering, right? Assuming you do shifshuf, then what's this machlok at the rabbis and the achirim is the beged is or mechabso or not or megararo. That must be talking about hard leather. So you could possibly explain the whole thing about Rav Chia bar Rav that did in front of Rav, and he didn't say anything, was talking specifically about hard leather, and it was according to the rabbis who say, because remember, what did we say? Shichshuch in kibus lo. Why can't you do kibbutz? Because the rabbi's view, or right, you're allowed to do. One second, let me just think about it for a minute. Because sorry, that's why acherim, right? Doesn't match the rabbis. That's why I was stuck. If you say like acherim, then you say there is kibbutz by leather, and that's why he could only pour the water, but he couldn't rub it together because that would be kibbutz even in something hard. Okay, so to review, let's just look at our chart. We started with Abaye, who said it's just a machloket tanaim between our Mishna and the Mishnah Shabbat that seemed to say you could pour water, which we thought meant kibbutz, because the rabbis say there is no kibbutz by or, and that's why you can do it on Shabbat, or you won't be liable if you do it on Shabbat. Whereas acherim say no, it is kibbutz, and that's why we do it in the mikdash, right, on leather. Then we move to Rava, who first thought it's going to be a distinction between soft and hard. In the end, he does keep that distinction somewhat, but he says the following. He still thinks the machloket, the rabbis and acherim, is in hard. And he originally thought the Mishnah Shabbat was hard, but then we explained the Mishnah Shabbat. No, the Mishnah Shabbat is actually soft, but it's without shifshuf, without rubbing it. And that's why it's okay. And that's the way you can explain also Rav Chia bar Avin, or you can explain Rav Chia bar Avin that was hard, and he just holds like acherim who think even in hard there's such a thing as laundering leather, and that's why he was able to pour the water, but it wasn't considered laundering because he didn't do the shifshuf. Okay, that's the main distinction according to Rava. Now the Gemara says, wait a minute. Now what I didn't tell you is, and the Gemara didn't tell you, that's why I didn't tell you, in this Mishnah in Shabbat where it says Haytashal or noten alei hamayim ad shtichle, it comes after it says, but if it was beged, you can't put water on, okay? You can't do anything. That would be kibbutz. That would be laundering on Shabbat. So if the whole theory is to say that it's not laundering unless you rub it, well, ihachi beged nami. So then why is clothing a problem to just pour water on it? To which the answer, beged shriyato zeu kibbutz. In a clothing, a cloth, putting it in water is enough to consider laundry. So for leather, no. For clothing, yes. Makes sense even, right? You could soak clothing and sometimes the stain gets out just by soaking it. The Rava Latame, and Rava goes according to something he says elsewhere. The Amar Rava, he's consistent. Zarak sudar lamayim chayav. If you throw a cloth into water, you're liable on Shabbat because you laundered it. And he also says, which is totally unconnected, but it's another thing that you could throw, zarak zera into water and be chayav, but it's for a completely different reason. Zarak zera pishtan lamayim chayav. If you throw flax seeds into water, you're liable. So bishlama sudar, we understand the cloth because avi kibbutz, because you're laundering. Ela zera pishtan my time, but why the zera pishtan? V'chi tema mishum demikadach, maybe it sprouts and it's a problem of zorea, of planting. But ihachi chite b'sarinami, why they specifically pick flax seeds? They could have picked something much more basic. Wheat, barley. So hanach itle riri. No. The issue is not planting and it's going to sprout. The issue is it has like a sticky substance that comes out of it. And what happens? They stick together. Okay, what malach is sticking them together? I don't know. So the Gemara says, "Yihachi shlachim namni." If we worry about sticking things together, the same would happen with pieces of leather. Put 2 pieces of leather in water; they'll also get sticky and they'll stick together. Listen, hatam ka'avid lisha. When you put flax seeds in the water, and they get like a sticky thing comes out of them and sticks them together, and then it's in this water. It makes the water thicker, and it's like you're kneading. So it comes from the problem of kneading, and that's why you're going to be liable on Shabbat for doing this. That was a total non sequitur, and we're going to move on. Darash Rava. Now here, there's a bit of a strange sugya, because now we're going to see that Rava says something and then changes his mind, and because of something Rav Papa says, and then we're going to see, though, he changed his mind to exactly what we already know Rava says. So maybe this happened earlier, and maybe that was when he changed his mind, because remember, he changed his mind throughout the sugya. So anyway, let's read it like that. Darash Rava, mutar lechabes min al b'Shabbat. You can clean your shoe on Shabbat, like properly launder it. Amalei Rav Papa leRava. Rav Papa said to Rava, but Hamar Rav Chia bar Ashi is in Nisagin Havakim Nekamei Derav. V'shach shchelim esani b'mayim. What do you see from here? Like we just said in the end of Rav. Shich shuchin aval kibus lo. Right. At first we thought he was laundering them. Then we said no. It seems to say specifically shichshuk. He threw water on it, but he didn't rub them. So it sounds like you can't really rub them, which means you can't really wash your shoes on Shabbat. So that's how he questions Rava. To which Hadar okay Rava emora alei darish. Rava then puts up an emora, which is like a loudspeaker. It's a person who's going to be his megaphone, who's going to say whatever his drasha is to other people. And he got up and he stood up to correct himself and he said it. Right? You love when people do this. Right? The things I said were a big mistake. Right? I was wrong. In fact, they say rubbing it pouring water on is fine, but really laundering it by rubbing it, that's going to be forbidden. And like I said, that conclusion matches what our conclusion was before. Hakibus b'makom kadosh. Now, this is going to be fairly simple, and we're going to go back to the study guide because the study guide has the psukim. We're going to darshan the psukim on the other halachot in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah had said you have to do the kibus, while laundering the garment, and the breaking of the earthenware vessel, and the cleaning of the klein choshet, of the metal implements, in the Azara. Where do we get this from? So if you look at the psukim, a pasuk, we're in Vayikra chapter 6, verse 20. Okay, from the middle of the pasuk. If you sprinkle blood sprinkles on the clothing, right? Whatever sprinkled on it, that's why that seems unnecessary. That's why we darshaned all sorts of things, like it includes leather, it includes some other things. Tichabes b'makom kadosh. You should launder it in a holy place. So that's where the braita is going to start. So Minan, immediately, where do we get it has to be makom kadosh? That's very clear. We don't really need a braita for this. Ditanu Rabbanan, the braita says, Tichabes b'makom kadosh. Okay, from there you see it's in the Azara. Shvirat kli cheres minayin. How do we know the breaking of the kli cheres? So now the next pasuk says, U kli cheres asher tivushal bo yishaver. Break the earthenware vessel if you cook the meat in it. Notice it starts with a vav. U kli cheres. End. So end is going to connect it to the previous, and that's why that was b'makom kadosh. This also is. And mirikav shtifa b'klei nechoshet minayin. Same thing with the next. Talmud lamar ve'im b'klei nechoshet bushalom u'rak u'shutaf b'mayim. Okay, same thing. Ve'im in the next pasuk, right? It says en kli cheres and klei nechoshet. So there's two ends in that pasuk that connects all of these things together. They're all in a sanctified place. Okay, last section here before we get to the next Mishnah. Now we're going to go back to the Mishnah, and the last line of the Mishnah was, this is a case where the chatat is more severe than other things. And we said there were two different ways, but we'll go with the blood needs to be washed in the azara only for a chatat. And in this way, the chatat is more severe than other kodshe kodshim. To which the Gemara says, v'tuleka, what? This is the only way? There aren't other things? And now we're going to have a list, okay, we're going to start with a whole bunch of questions. Ha'ika shenichnas dama lifnim. Okay, some people have lefanai v'lifnim. Either which way, it's the chataot pnimiyot. We have these unique sin offerings that they're the only ones that the blood is brought on the inner altar. So they say, b'chataot chitzoniyot. No, we mean of the regular offerings that are all done on the outer altar. We're comparing chatat to ones that are similar to it that are all done on the outer altar. We're not comparing those unique ones that are the chataot pnimiyot. Okay, second chumrah, stringency by chatat. Sheim nichnas dama lifnim psula. Remember that halacha? You're not allowed to bring the blood of the chatat, any blood of the chatat. That you bring the blood inside to the hechal, to the sanctuary, is disqualified. That's a chumrah by chatat. It's not by other things. Why didn't it mention that one? Well, you might remember we learned this, and there were different opinions about what it applied to. And Rabbi Akiva said, Ki Rabbi Akiva da'amar, the Mishnah must hold like Rabbi Akiva, who said, Kol damim shenichnesu le'echal lechaper psulim. This actually applies to all korbanot, even though it said chatat. It also said all. So it meant all means everything. Okay? Now, next, shkem, another stringency. Third one. Shkem b'chaprim achai v'kritot. Sin offerings atone for very severe punishments like karet. Well, b'chatat d'shmiat kol. There is one chatat. If you hear evidence and you don't testify about it, and then you lie under oath and say, I didn't know any testimony, you take an oath, then you have to bring a korban chatat, and that's not a sin that's punishable by karet. So that would be another, that's really then similar to all the others. Shekain tuna arba matanot. Remember, the blood of the chatat goes on all four sides of the altar, and the blood of the other sacrifices don't. Well, ki Rabbi Yishmael da amar kol damim tunim arba matanot. Now, if you remember, the other bloods need two, which are four, right? You do it on two corners instead of all four corners, but you get to all four sides. And there was a machloket there, whether you do it. It was actually a machloket Rabbi Shmuel, and then we said it's a machloket Tanaim as well, and Rabbi Yishmael is one of them. And then in a minute we're going to say his opinion, but there's a machloket. Do you do it in one placing on the corner and get it on both sides at the same time? Or do you do you're standing at each of the two opposite corners and you do one on this side, one on that side, one on this side, one on that side, in which case there'd be four placements, just like there are four placements by the chatat. Now it's done a little differently because the chatat, you go to each of the four corners, but you still do four placings of the blood. So that's what they say. Ki Rabbi Yishmael Amar kol damim tunim arba matanot. Okay, so first they say, look, only the chatat needs four placements, and that's true according to the ones who say it's really two, that you just get it on all four sides. But according to Rabbi Yishmael, you also do it on all four sides. But al arba kranot. And we get to the question that they can't really answer, which is, but only the chatat needs all four corners. This does need that you do on two corners. You get to all four sides in four different placements, but you don't have to go to all four corners, whereas the chatat needs to be on all four corners. To which the Gemara, and then we're stuck because this isn't the only chumrah, stringency of chatat, right? The one about kibus, about washing the blood out. So they answer, okay, wait a minute. Vilita mech, according to what you're saying, ha'ika keren, they also have to be put, the chatat, on the corner itself, on those horns of the altar. Ha'ika etzba, the kohen has to dip his finger, that's another chumrah. And ha'ika chudan, there's also, according to some people, you have to do it exactly on the corner where the two sides meet. Ela chad mitrei tzlata chumrei naki. They only chose one out of two or three chumras, but there really are more. It doesn't mean this is the only chumrah. Right? That was the topic they were talking about. So they said in this way the chatat's more severe. Yeah, there's other ways also. Okay, new Mishna. Beged sheyatzah chutz leklaim. Now, we learned about sacrificial items. You can't take them out of the azara. What if you took out the blood, the shirt that had the blood on it, out of the azara? Now, you have to clean it in the azara. But what if you took it out? Well, there's nothing disqualified. It's anyway not something you're going to use and put on the altar. So it's fine that it went out. You just have to nichnasu mechabso mukom kadosh. You just bring it back in. Very simple. But what if you brought it out, nitma chutz leklaim, and then somehow the cloth with the blood on it got impure when you were outside? So now you're stuck because you can't bring it in. On the other hand, you have to wash it. And where do you have to wash it? In the azara. But you can't bring it back to the azara because it's impure. You can't bring impure things in. So what do? You get rid of the tumah. How do you get rid of the tumah? Oh, you tear it. You tear the shirt. And once you tear the shirt, it's not susceptible to impurity, and the impurity leaves it. Okay, we have this with earthenware vessels. You can break an earthenware vessel, and then that's not impure anymore because it's not a vessel, and it doesn't have impurity. So you tear it, and then you go back in, and you take the part that has the blood on it, and you wash it in the holy place. We're now going to do the same thing with the earthenware vessel and with the metal implement, just each one has its own little unique way of doing it. So the kli cheres has to be broken. So what do? If it takes, again, this is part one. You take it out of the azara, it doesn't become impure. So you bring it back in and then you do it and you do what you're supposed to do, break it in the azara. But if it got impure, nitma chutz leklaim, if when you took it out it became impure, nukvo, you make a hole in it, because a vessel with a hole in it, an earthenware vessel with a hole is useless. Nichnas v'shavro b'makom kadosh, and then you bring it back in, because then once it becomes useless, it's not susceptible to impurity anymore, it's no longer a vessel, you can bring it back in and you break it completely then inside. Right, so if you have this metal vessel that went out, you just bring it back in and you do the shtifa marika. We're going to talk about all what that is exactly further on, a few more dapim. You do that in the azara. Nitma chutz leklaim, but if it became impure outside the azara, pochato, you have to really make it smaller, meaning a small hole like you do in an earthenware vessel isn't enough. You have to make a bigger hole, because a metal implement can be used for all sorts of things, unless it's a really big hole that you've really kind of made it very useless. Then it will be not susceptible to impurity anymore. And then you can bring it back in and do the marika and shtifa, the washing and the rinsing and the scouring in the azara. Okay, we'll start with this question of Ravina and see how we answer it. Matkefla Ravina. Ravina says, wait a minute. Let's go back to the clothing. Koro, if you tear it, you have a problem, because then it's not a cloth anymore. No, so that's good for impurity purposes. But when we bring it back in, we have a problem, because what's the commandment? Beged amarachman v'lav begedhu. They say you have to wash the beged. It's not a beged anymore, because it's not. That's the whole point. We just tore it. It's not even considered a beged. So they say the mishayir bakadema aporet. They leave a little bit. Okay, Rashi explains what this is. You don't you make a tear down the front, but you don't completely separate it into two. You leave a little bit of like a length of a handkerchief type thing. And then, right, it's going to be tahor from its impurity because most of it really isn't useful, but you do have a little piece and then it's still a beged and you can then wash it and be yotzi or chiyuv of washing the beged. But the Gemara says, what do you mean? It's not susceptible to impurity if you leave a ma'aporet. Ini, it is. Listen, Hama Rav Huna lo shanu ela. Okay, Rav Huna was talking about a Mishnah in Chulin. Okay, we're talking about impurity, and it's talking about a talit that becomes impure, and then it says they start to rip it. Okay, as long as you don't leave over lo shanu ela shelo shiur b'kadei ma'aporet. He explains this Mishnah that that's only if you didn't leave over a ma'aporet, then it will be impure. But if this cloth is still somewhat together and you have this amount of cloth there, like a ma'aporet, then it's as if we view this as one cloth and it's totally susceptible to impurity. So now we're back to how do you bring it into the temple? And it's really this question of how do you, on the one hand, call it a cloth and on the other hand, not call it a cloth. It's right. You need it to be a cloth for the purposes of that, but not for the purpose of that. It's very confusing. And it seems like the criteria are the same. To which the answer, midrabanan. What Rav Huna was saying is just exera derabanan. It's really not susceptible to impurity. On a rabbinic level, the rabbis said we're going to call this impure because it's still you have a piece of cloth there. But it's really not. And therefore, for the Torah law of bringing it back into the Azara, we allow it back into the Azara and allow you then to do kibbutz on a beged because it's enough of a beged for kibbutz, but it's not enough for impurity. With that, we finished. So let's review our daf. We started with the issue of the machlok of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yeshua about the beged, about the leather. Once it's right, when it's not yet, is it ra'oi or not ra'oi? We talk about the nafkaminas of how they understood the word beged in the pasuk, and then right, three different explanations there. Then we talked about it doesn't need kibbutz. Right, sorry, only the spot needs kibbutz. We saw the drasha for that. We saw this idea about what does it mean for oil kibbutz? Well, that you don't scrape it generally, and then we have this whole thing about wait. Is leather something you scrape or is leather something you launder? And then we had this contradiction between this and the Shabbat and how do we resolve it? Either, right, there's some machloket about it or we had some other way of explaining it. Then we got to so we had Abaye's explanation, we have Rava's first explanation, Rava's second explanation. And from there we got off onto the kibbutz b'makom kadosh. Where do we get it from the psukim? And the other things have to be b'makom kadosh because of the vavs that connected them. Zeh chomer bechatat. Wait, aren't there other stringencies about chatat? So we resolve those, and then we ended with what happens if it leaves the azara, and then you have to bring it back in. But if it becomes impure, then you have to bring it back in a way that it's already not susceptible to impurity, but yet still is considered a beged. And that was the whole navigating we did at the very end of the sugya. With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day and a happy Hanukkah.